The land stretched wide, flat, and endless, its grasses bending low under the steady push of the evening wind. The sun was sinking, a red disk rolling toward the horizon, and shadows reached long across the prairie. The rancher stood at the edge of his cabin porch, one hand resting on the wooden post, the other holding a tin cup of water that had long since grown warm. His eyes traced the horizon the way they always did, scanning for movement, though he rarely saw any. The prairie was a lonely place, and he had grown used to the silence that came with it. His life was simple, marked by routine that never seemed to change. Before dawn, he rose from the narrow bed inside his small cabin. He boiled coffee in the tin pot that never quite came clean, pulled on his boots, and walked out into the chill of morning. The cattle needed tending, the fences always sagged, and the well sometimes yielded less water than it should. His hands were rough from rope and wood, his shoulders strong from years of lifting what could not be left alone. Every day was the same: work from sunup to sundown, then a small meal by the fire and sleep that never seemed long enough. Inside the cabin, there was little more than necessity. A table with one chair, a bed against the wall, a rifle propped in the corner, and shelves holding what food he could keep from spoiling. The hearth was the only place that gave warmth, the fire crackling low in the evenings while the wind whispered through cracks in the boards. Some nights he played a tune on his harmonica, a slow melody that echoed against the empty walls. But most nights, he let silence settle heavy around him, staring into the flames until his eyes grew heavy. The rancher was not a cruel man, nor was he bitter. He had simply learned to live without expecting much. Out on the prairie, survival came first. You grew used to the loneliness, to the absence of voices, to the long stretches of days where no one crossed your path. He did not complain, though at times he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, especially when he lay awake at night, listening to nothing but the wind. That evening, as the sun bled out across the land, he thought it would be like any other. He had mended the fence at the far end of the pasture, driven a stray cow back to the herd, and chopped enough wood to last the week. His body ached, but it was the familiar ache of work well done. He was ready to retreat into the small circle of light inside his cabin and let the darkness cover the land outside. But just as he turned toward the door, he heard something strange, faint, carried on the wind, not the sound of animal or storm. It was a soft cry, small, high, and desperate. His head lifted, eyes narrowing. At first he thought it might be a coyote, but the sound came again, closer this time, and it was not the call of any beast. It was the voice of a child. He set down his cup, his hand instinctively brushing against the rifle by the door before he stepped off the porch. The air was cooling fast, shadows deepening, but he walked forward slowly, scanning the tall grasses. The sound came again, this time a whimper followed by the rustle of movement. His boots pressed against the earth, steady, cautious, until he saw her. She was small, no older than 12, her dark hair tangled, her clothes torn from running through brush and grass. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear, and she stumbled as though her legs could no longer carry her. She stopped when she saw him, frozen like a rabbit caught in the open. For a long moment, neither moved. The rancher, tall and rough from years of work, must have seemed a giant to her. She looked ready to bolt, though she had no strength left to run. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, his voice low and calm. "Easy now." The girl trembled, her breath quick, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She glanced behind her, toward the horizon, as though expecting someone or something to appear. Then her eyes came back to him, filled with mistrust but also with a faint spark of hope. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure she believed him. "You're cold. Hungry too, I'd wager." Her eyes darted to the cabin, then back to his face. She shook her head slightly, as if torn between fear and need. Her lips parted, but no words came. The rancher knew the signs of exhaustion. He could see it in the way her knees wavered, in the way her arms clutched herself as though to keep from falling apart. She would not last long out in the open. not with the cold creeping in and the night pressing close. He took another step, then another, until he was close enough to kneel down in the grass, lowering himself so he did not tower above her. "Come inside," he said softly, "just for a little while. Rest. Then we'll see." The girl's gaze flickered again toward the cabin. For a moment she stood frozen, weighing her choices. Then her body gave way. Her knees buckled, and before she could fall, the rancher reached out, steadying her gently with his arms. She did not fight him, too weak to resist. He lifted her easily, cradling her light frame against his chest, and carried her back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire was low, but he stoked it quickly, flames rising to cast warmth across the room. He set her carefully in the chair by the hearth, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and poured water into a tin cup. She drank in small, desperate sips, her eyes never leaving his face, still watchful, still unsure. He sliced bread, laid it on the table, and pushed it gently toward her. She hesitated, then took it, eating in small bites as though afraid it might disappear. The rancher sat across from her, his hands resting on the table, his voice calm but steady. "You're safe here," he repeated. "No harm will come to you." She said nothing, but her shoulders eased a little beneath the blanket. Her eyes softened, though the fear had not fully left them. She was Comanche. He could see it clearly in her features, in the quiet strength that lingered even in her exhaustion. He knew what it meant, knew the danger of sheltering her. But as he watched her eat, watched her small hands tremble with hunger and cold, none of that mattered. She was a child. She needed shelter, and he would give it no matter the cost. The night deepened outside, the wind pressing against the walls, the prairie stretching silent and endless. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight. The girl's breathing slowed, her eyes heavy with sleep. She leaned back in the chair, her head tilting against the blanket, her small body finally giving in to rest. The rancher watched her for a long time, the weight of the choice settling over him. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he knew only this. He had opened his door, and in doing so, he had crossed into something far greater than himself. The fire burned low through the night, casting a soft glow across the cabin walls. The rancher sat in his chair, boots planted firm against the floor, eyes half closed but never fully at rest. Across from him, wrapped in the blanket, the girl slept, her breathing shallow, her small frame curled tight like she was still ready to flee. Each time the fire cracked, she stirred, her eyes fluttering before settling back to uneasy rest. He watched her in silence, wondering what had driven her across the prairie alone, wondering who might be searching for her in the darkness. The hours crept slow, the sound of wind rising outside pressing against the boards. The prairie never truly slept. Coyotes yipped in the distance, owls called from the trees, and the cattle shifted restlessly in the corral. But it was the silence inside that weighed on him most. He had lived alone for so long that the sound of another breathing in his cabin felt strange, almost unsettling. Yet there was something steady in it too, something that softened the edges of the loneliness he had carried for years. By dawn, the fire had burned down to embers. He rose quietly, careful not to wake her, and stepped outside into the chill. The sky was pale, streaked with pink, the air sharp in his lungs. He moved to the barn, fed the horses, scattered hay for the cattle, and checked the water troughs. It was the same routine he had done every morning, but it felt different now, knowing that when he returned to the cabin, someone would be waiting. When he came back inside, the girl was awake. She sat stiff in the chair, the blanket still pulled around her shoulders, her dark eyes sharp with suspicion. She did not move when he entered, only watched, her body taut like a bowstring. He set bread on the table, poured water into a cup, and nodded toward it. "Eat," he said simply. For a moment she did not move. Then slowly she reached forward, her hands quick and cautious, pulling the bread close as if afraid he might take it away. She ate in silence, her gaze never leaving him. He let her, saying nothing more, moving about the room with quiet steadiness. He stoked the fire, filled the kettle, set beans to boil. The cabin filled with the smell of smoke and cooking, and the girl's shoulders eased just a fraction, though she still kept her eyes on him as though measuring every move. It was then that he felt it, a shift in the air outside. He paused, his body going still, his ears straining against the silence. The sound came faint at first, hooves, many of them, moving across the ground in steady rhythm. His stomach tightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle resting in the corner. He crossed to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to look. What he saw made his chest seize. Riders. Dozens of them, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. They moved in a wide arc, spreading out, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. He counted quickly, but the number grew too high to keep pace. Not 10, not 20, but far more. His breath caught as the full sight came into view, warriors, their bodies painted, their horses decorated with feathers and beads, their faces sharp with purpose. At their head rode a figure taller, broader, his presence commanding. The rancher knew without being told this was the girl's people. The girl must have sensed it too. She rose from the chair, the blanket falling to the floor, her eyes wide, her breath sharp. She moved to the door, then stopped, torn between fear and relief. She looked at the rancher, her small frame trembling, as though she did not know whether to run to them or stay where she was. The rancher's jaw tightened. His hand stayed near the rifle, but he did not lift it. To raise a weapon against so many would be foolish, suicide. Yet to do nothing was to leave himself vulnerable. He stood still, waiting, watching as the riders slowed, surrounding his cabin in a wide circle. The sound of hooves filled the air, shaking the ground beneath him. 70, maybe more. The rancher swallowed hard, his chest tight. His cabin, his land, his life, all of it was caught in the circle of their power. He could feel their eyes on him, sharp and unyielding, watching from every direction. His pulse pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm, to move slow. He lifted his hands, palms open, a sign of peace, though he kept his rifle close within reach. The riders halted, their horses stamping, snorting, tossing their heads. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of what could come next. Then from the front the chief dismounted. He was older, his hair long, streaked with gray, his chest bare but for the beads and leather that marked his place. His eyes were dark, steady, filled with the kind of authority that needed no words. He walked forward slowly, every step measured, until he stood just beyond the porch. The girl let out a small cry, her voice breaking the silence. "Father!" The rancher's eyes flicked to her, then back to the man standing before him. So this was her father, the leader of these warriors, the man whose word could mean life or death in an instant. The chief's gaze swept over the cabin, then locked on the rancher. For a long moment, no one moved. The air between them was taut as wire, stretched by silence and unspoken questions. The chief finally spoke, his voice low, even, but carrying weight. The words were not in English at first, sharp syllables rolling like stones. Then slowly he shifted, speaking in words the rancher could understand. "You sheltered my daughter." The rancher nodded once. His voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. "She came to my door. She was cold, hungry. I gave her food, fire, a place to rest." The chief's eyes narrowed. "You know who she is, you know what it means to keep her." The rancher's hand twitched near the rifle, then stilled. He met the chief's gaze, unflinching. "She is a child. I could not leave her in the dark." Around them the warriors shifted, their horses stamping, their spears and bows glinting in the morning light. The air felt thick enough to choke, each second stretched long. The rancher could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against him, could see in their eyes the question of whether his words were enough. The girl stepped forward then, her small voice breaking again. "He helped me." She looked from her father to the rancher, her eyes shining with urgency. "He gave me bread. He kept me safe." The chief's eyes softened just slightly as he looked at his daughter. Then his gaze returned to the rancher, sharp once more. One wrong step and this land would burn. His hand gestured to the warriors behind him, 70 strong, each ready to act at his command. "You risk much, stranger." The rancher's voice remained calm, though inside his pulse thundered. "Sometimes a man must risk much to do what's right." The words hung in the air, heavy and certain. The warriors watched, waiting for their chief's answer. The girl stood between them, her eyes wide, her breath quick. The rancher stood tall at his door, his hands open, his rifle still untouched. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the earth, as two worlds faced one another, caught on the edge of choice. The air was heavy, filled with the steady snort of horses and the shifting weight of 70 warriors staring him down. The rancher's cabin stood small against their circle, a fragile outpost surrounded by power he could not match. The chief's gaze never wavered, dark and sharp, his presence commanding more than the weapons at his back. The girl stood between them, her blanket still draped over her shoulders, her eyes darting from her father to the man who had sheltered her. The rancher felt the weight of every eye pressing against him, but he did not flinch. He kept his hands visible, his voice low, and even when he finally spoke, "I gave her bread, I gave her warmth, I did nothing more." His words carried no apology, only simple truth. The chief studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His men shifted, restless, but no order came. Then the chief took one slow step closer. His voice, when he spoke, was measured but heavy with warning. "Men do not shelter what is not theirs without reason. Tell me why." The rancher swallowed, his throat dry, but his eyes held steady. "Because she was a child at my door, alone, hungry. I could not turn her away." For a heartbeat, silence held them all. The wind stirred the grasses, a hawk cried far above, but nothing else moved. Then, unexpectedly, the chief's gaze flicked to his daughter. She looked back at him with wide, pleading eyes. She whispered something in their own tongue, the words soft but urgent. The rancher could not understand, but he saw the way her father's face shifted, if only slightly. The rancher knew this was not a moment to boast or bargain. He let the quiet stretch, let his stillness show he meant no harm. He kept his posture straight, his hands steady, his voice calm when he finally added, "A child in need should find a door that opens. That is all I have to give." The chief studied him longer, his face hard as stone. Then he lifted his hand, and one of the warriors dismounted, striding forward with long, quick steps. The man circled the cabin, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of deceit. He opened the door without asking, stepping inside, his presence filling the small space. He looked at the hearth, the table, the chair where the girl had slept. He saw the half-empty loaf of bread, the embers of the fire, the folded blanket. Then he returned outside, speaking quickly in their language, his voice clipped but not accusing. The chief listened, then turned back to the rancher. He stepped close enough that the space between them was heavy with tension, close enough that the rancher could see the lines carved deep into his weathered face. "You risked your life," the chief said slowly. "You risked your land." For her, the rancher nodded once, his voice quiet but steady. "I could not do otherwise." The chief tilted his head, searching his eyes for any falter. But the rancher stood firm, the honesty of his choice laid bare in the stillness of his gaze. At last the chief turned slightly, his voice sharp as he called something back to his men. The circle shifted, the warriors adjusting, but their weapons did not rise. The girl's eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. She took one step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke to her father again. He listened, his expression tight, then lifted his chin as though weighing something unseen. He looked at her, then at the rancher once more. The rancher's chest tightened, but he did not move, did not speak. He let the chief see his steadiness, his lack of fear, his lack of falsehood. He knew he could not match their numbers, could not fight them if they chose violence. His only weapon was truth, his only shield the honesty of his act. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice low but carrying to all who waited. "You showed her mercy. Mercy is not weakness. It is a strength many forget." The words rippled through the circle, carried by the listening ears of 70 warriors. Some nodded faintly, others remained still, their eyes fixed on the rancher. He felt the weight of their judgment, but he did not lower his gaze. The chief stepped back slightly, his hand resting briefly on his daughter's shoulder. She leaned toward him, her small body trembling with relief. Then he looked once more at the rancher, his eyes sharp but no longer filled with threat. If you had harmed her, your house would be ash and your blood would water this ground." His voice hardened, each word striking with force. "But you did not. You remembered honor when others might not." The rancher inclined his head, the faintest gesture of acknowledgement. He felt no triumph, only a steady release of breath he had not realized he was holding. The chief turned to his daughter, speaking to her in their language. Her eyes softened, her shoulders easing as she listened. She glanced once more at the rancher, her gaze lingering, a silent gratitude in the curve of her expression. Then she stepped closer to her father, taking her place by his side. The warriors remained still, their circle unbroken, but the sharp edge of danger began to ease. The horses pawed at the ground, tossing their heads as though sensing the shift. The rancher kept his body calm, though his pulse still pounded in his chest. He knew this moment was not yet finished, that one wrong move could still unravel it. The chief faced him once more. "You live alone on this land. Alone men can become careless. Remember what you carry now. My daughter's life touched your fire. That binds us in ways you may not see." The rancher nodded once more, his voice low. "I will remember." The chief studied him for another long moment, then gave a sharp call. The warriors stirred, shifting their horses, the sound of hooves filling the air as they began to move. The circle loosened, the weight of their presence lifting as they turned their mounts toward the horizon. The girl looked back once, her eyes meeting the rancher's in silence before turning with her people. The rancher remained on the porch, his hands steady at his sides, watching as 70 warriors rode away, their figures shrinking against the vast sweep of the prairie. The air grew quieter with each hoofbeat fading into the distance, until at last only the wind remained, carrying the faint echo of what had passed. He stood still, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths, his body heavy with the tension that had finally broken. The morning sun climbed higher, casting its light across his land, warming the boards of his small cabin. The ground that had moments before trembled under the weight of so many hooves now lay calm, still, as though nothing had happened. But everything had. Inside, the fire had burned low again, the blanket still draped across the chair where the girl had sat. He stepped back into the cabin, the silence returning, but not the same as it had been. Something had shifted, something unspoken, something that could not be undone. The prairie seemed quieter after the riders left, as though the land itself was catching its breath. Dust hung in the air where 70 horses had stirred the earth, then drifted slowly down until it settled once more into silence. The rancher stood at the porch, his hand still resting on the doorframe, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last figures had disappeared. The weight of their presence still clung to him. His body felt heavy, his chest tight, his ears ringing faintly with the echo of hooves. For a long while he did not move, only stared into the distance, waiting for some sign they might return. The wind pushed gently at his shoulders, carrying the smell of trampled grass and horse sweat, but no sound followed. The prairie stretched wide and empty again, the same as it had been before, yet not the same at all. His land had been touched by something greater than him, and he knew it. When he finally stepped back inside the cabin, the silence pressed different. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing faintly, casting a dim red light across the floorboards. The blanket the girl had used lay crumpled on the chair, a small mark of her presence. He picked it up, folded it slowly, and laid it across the back of the chair. His fingers lingered there a moment longer than they needed to, then dropped away. He moved through the cabin with deliberate slowness, stoking the fire, setting the kettle to boil, tidying the table. The motions were familiar, the same as he had done every day, but the meaning had shifted. He found himself glancing toward the door more than once, half expecting the sound of hooves, half hoping to see the girl step back inside. Each time the sight of empty prairie greeted him, and each time he returned to his work with a heaviness that pressed deeper than before. The day stretched long. He went about the chores as he always had, hauling water, checking fences, scattering feed for the cattle. The animals sensed the change too, their heads lifting more often, their ears pricked at every faint sound. The rancher moved among them, steady and calm, but his mind wandered back to the circle of warriors, to the chief's eyes, to the girl's small voice breaking through the tension. As evening came, he stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun sink low. The sky burned with orange and red, fading into purple, the colors stretching wide across the land. He leaned against the fence post, his hands rough against the wood, and let the silence wash over him. Yet beneath the silence was a hum, an awareness that his life had crossed paths with something that would not be forgotten. When darkness fell, he returned to the cabin. The fire warmed the room, but the air still felt different. He sat at the table, the harmonica resting in his hands, but no tune came. Instead, he set it aside and leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. He thought of the girl's eyes, the way they had softened when she ate, the way she had whispered to her father, the way she had looked back at him as she rode away. Gratitude had lived in that glance, unspoken but unmistakable. The nights that followed were restless. He slept in short stretches, waking often to the memory of hooves pounding the earth, to the image of warriors surrounding his home. Sometimes he rose before dawn, stepping outside into the cold to walk the fence line, scanning the horizon though nothing moved there. The prairie was vast, but he could not shake the sense that he was no longer alone upon it. Their eyes had measured him, weighed him, judged him, and in some quiet way they had found him worthy. That knowledge lingered heavier than fear. Days passed, and his routine returned, though never in the same shape as before. He worked the land, tended the cattle, chopped wood, but each task carried the faint shadow of memory. He noticed small details he had once overlooked, the way the morning light touched the grasses, the way the wind carried distant sounds across miles, the way silence could hold both threat and peace. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he thought again of the chief's words. Mercy is not weakness. The phrase turned over and over in his mind, cutting deep. He had not thought of himself as merciful, only practical, only decent enough to offer food and warmth to a child in need. But to the chief, to the warriors, to the girl, it had meant more. It had been a choice heavy with consequence, a choice that could have ended in fire and ash, but instead had opened into something unexpected. The rancher began to feel a new sense of watchfulness in his work. Each time he rode the pasture, each time he checked the creek, he felt eyes on him, though he never saw them. He wondered if the Comanche watched from the hills, testing his truth, measuring whether his honor held steady even when unseen. He moved with calm, never rushing, never careless, always steady. If they were watching, he wanted them to see the same man they had met that morning, the man who did not waver. Sometimes at night, he sat at the porch with his rifle across his knees, not in fear but in quiet readiness. He thought of the girl then, of her trust, of the way her voice had pierced the circle of warriors. He thought of her father, his sharp gaze softened by her words, his judgment tempered by her presence. He wondered what they said of him now, if his name carried through their campfires, if the story of his cabin had become a story of its own. The land around him had not changed, but he had. His days of solitude felt different now, colored by the knowledge that he had been part of something greater than himself. He no longer felt quite as invisible on the prairie. His small cabin, once a place of silence, had become a place where two worlds had touched, where mercy had spoken louder than weapons. Weeks passed, the prairie shifting from autumn into the edge of winter. Frost clung to the grasses in the mornings, and his breath hung white in the air as he moved among the cattle. The wind grew sharper, carrying with it the promise of snow. He worked harder, storing hay, chopping wood, preparing for the season ahead. Yet through it all, the memory of that morning lingered, steady as the beat of his own heart. Sometimes he wondered if they would return. Sometimes he half expected to see riders cresting the horizon, their horses dark against the sky. Perhaps they never would. Perhaps they had judged the matter closed, his act of sheltering already weighed and recorded in their minds. But whether they came again or not, the bond remained. The land itself seemed to carry it, whispering through the grasses, echoing in the wind, reminding him each day of what had passed. And so he lived, steady as ever, but with a new fire burning quietly inside him. The cabin was still small, the work still endless, the nights still long, but something had changed. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a pause, a space between two worlds that had touched and stepped back, leaving behind a thread that could not be broken. The rancher rose each morning as he always had, pulled on his boots, lit the fire, and walked out into the cold dawn. Yet with every breath he drew, he carried the weight of what had happened, the choice he had made, the eyes that had measured him, the mercy that had bound him to something larger than his own small life. He did not speak of it, for there was no one to tell, but it lived in him all the same, steady as the earth beneath his feet, wide as the prairie stretching out before him.